Famicom gets its first third-party sequel. Maybe there's a future in this little system after all. It's episode 28 of NES Works Gaiden.
Eat my shorts.
Our second release from Jaleco means our second Famicom game that has the back of its box printed upside down. Anyway, unlike xRGB, Formation Z did not previously appear on SG-1000, although it does play an awful lot like a game we saw back on SG-1000 in 1984, specifically Orgus. Formation Z arrives on Famicom a full year or so after Orgus's debut for Sega, though Jaleco initially distributed the game in arcades around the same time that the SG-1000 title debuted. In other words, the similarities in design are less about one developer swiping content from the other, and more about both games drawing inspiration from the same well, namely, anime by Big West. In 1982, Studio New in Artland collaborated to create a new television cartoon series strongly inspired by Mobile Suit Gundam, but far less pessimistic in nature. Known as Super Dimension Fortress Macross, this series received funding from a corporation called Big West Advertising, who went on to fund several additional projects, such as Super Dimension Cavalry Southern Cross and Super Dimension Century Orgus. Although these shows included no narrative overlap and stood alone as self-contained stories, separate from one another, they were joined by one common feature. They all revolved around transforming mecha designed to sell lots and lots of toys. Macross's debut coincided roughly with the evolution of Microman toys into Transformers, and both franchises arrived in the US at around the same time as part of an early wave of media properties that recalibrated foreign perspectives on Japanese media from being charming and corny to cutting edge and brilliant. Of course, the American perspective on Big West projects was deeply muddled by the localization process. Macross, Southern Cross, and a third property called Genesis Climber Mospeada were all rewritten by licensor Harmony Gold into a single project called Robotech, the latter properties being grafted onto the Macross storyline in order to bulk up the episode count to qualify for a syndication package. At the same time, Hasbro licensed the Macross Valkyrie fightercraft design from Takara to become the character Jetfire, meaning Harmony Gold couldn't release Transforming Valkyrie aka Veritech toys, and Transformers couldn't use Jetfire's toy design in cartoons. It was quite a mess. And all of this is of course a sidebar to Formation Z, which was completely unconnected to Transformers and the Big West anime properties. But it was certainly inspired by them. Formation Z deserves credit for beating both of the franchises it ripped off to the Famicom market. The first Macross game would hit Famicom at the end of 1985, and the infamously dreadful Transformers Convoy no Nazo would show up the following year. All three would revolve around the same premise. You control a robot that is also sometimes a fighter craft. You can transform and theoretically engage with enemies differently depending on your form. The fighter form allows you to maneuver quickly and dart around the screen, while the human robot form typically has to run along the ground and presents a larger, slower target. In other words, the robot is no fun to control, and there's no real reason anyone would choose to switch into that form unless it were absolutely necessary. For better or for worse, Formation Z aggressively necessitates the use of the robot form by imposing a sharp limitation on the jet mode. When you switch over to jet form, you have a huge advantage in combat, and you're able to skip over stretches of territory that would be impassable for your humanoid form. However, activating jet mode causes your fuel supply to deplete rapidly, sharply restricting the amount of time you can spend in flight. Running around and destroying enemies in robot mode can help recharge your fuel, allowing you to revert back to the sweet release of your aerial form. This element seems to have been adapted directly from Jaleco's previous Famicom release, xRGB. In that game, the player's craft had an unlimited supply of slow-moving single-rate projectiles, as well as a relatively small cache of a rapid-fire shot. Blasting enemies with the slower projectile would build up charges of the superior projectile. So by this metric, Jaleco's prevailing game design theory on NES seems to have been suffer a mediocre form of gameplay in order to access the fun kind. It's a bit like busy work, I guess, but it does at least give players reason to use that robot mode and justify the transformation gimmick. And I guess it's worth also noting that Formation Z represents a small technical first for the Famicom hardware as well. Unless I'm overlooking something, it's the first game to feature multiple planes of parallax background scrolling. I suppose that's something. Nintendo doles out another of its future black box NES launch sports games here with Soccer. And despite what Nintendo of America officially claims, this future black box release was actually only about half a year away, not 2 years away. While I originally grouped Soccer under NES Works 1987 due to multiple sources' dates, including Nintendo's very own, in point of fact, it's been confirmed that Soccer was released at the NES's soft launch back in October of 1985 in New York City. Viewed as a 1987 release, Nintendo's Soccer would not exactly send thrills of inspiration down the spine. As a 1985 title, though, we once again have a more capable genre entry that fits neatly into the overall gaming landscape. Players control an entire team of footballers here, passing the ball between active attackers, swapping defenders when the opponent takes possession, and generally fixating on the goal. At the time of Soccer's debut on Famicom, its chief competitors in the Japanese console market were Sega's Champion Soccer for SG-1000 and possibly Epoch's Super Soccer for Super Cassettvision. Nintendo's certainly looks and plays a far sight better than either. For one thing, the Famicom hardware can handle a field full of players with remarkable grace. Where the other Japanese consoles of the time suffered from rocky field scrolling and stilted player animation reminiscent of an LCD Game & Watch unit, the Famicom players zip around quickly across a pitch that moves smoothly and responsively to the left and the right. That horizontal orientation also sets Soccer apart from the competition. Both the SG-1000 and Super Cassettvision games scrolled on a vertical axis, while the Famicom game places the goals at the far left and right of the field. Not only does this better correspond to the hardware's graphical capabilities, it also benefits the action in subtle ways. All three games present the players from a top-down three-quarters perspective. When the action moves along a vertical field, players have a tendency to cluster up and overlap one another, because the majority of the action is set along the same axis at which their bodies are drawn. On Famicom, however, the action moves perpendicular to the players' bodies, meaning they naturally spread out more and leave more visual space between them, not to mention more space in which to maneuver and guide the ball. Less clustering means a given session is less likely to degenerate into an endless button-mashing exercise as players try to maintain control of the ball from opponents who constantly crowd them. All in all, it's as smooth and speedy a rendition of the sport as you could expect from a home console in 1987. More interesting Soccer adaptations would come along as Famicom and NES technology improved, but here in 1985, Soccer offers a worthy addition to the Famicom sports library. Lode Runner was a huge hit for Hudson on Famicom when it launched in the summer of 1984, just as it had been on Apple II for Broederbund the year before that. So naturally, flushed with success, Hudson turned its eyes westward almost immediately to begin working on a conversion of Lode Runner's follow-up, Championship Lode Runner. Championship Lode Runner will look familiar to anyone who played the previous NES game, as it uses the same graphical assets. However, this sequel makes a significant change over Hudson's previous work. Unlike with the original Lode Runner, graphics are the only thing that differentiate the Famicom release from the PC and SG-1000 releases by the same name. Lode Runner for Famicom was a much smaller game than its Apple and Sega counterparts, containing a mere 50 levels to the other version's 150 and 90 stages, respectively. It also reworked the layouts of several stages to better fit the Famicom's visual format, which included larger and more cartoon-like graphics. With Championship Lode Runner, however, Hudson hewed much closer to the original content. Yes, this cartridge still has those chubby little Famicom guys, which means each stage scrolls laterally to fit everything in, but otherwise Hudson's rendition of Championship Lode Runner perfectly matches the competing releases, down to the removal of the original game's level editor. I suppose it helped that Broederbund's original release of this game contained only 50 levels, meaning Hudson didn't have to budge an inch in terms of content volume. Championship Lode Runner is less a sequel than an expansion pack, compiling more than 46 of the most challenging creations that had been designed with the level editor included with the Apple II release. That challenging description is no joke. Championship Lode Runner takes no prisoners. From the very outset, these levels are basically action puzzles with only one solution, and that solution almost invariably involves executing a prescribed set of actions with nearly frame-perfect timing. You can use a level select feature here to sample any of the first 10 stages, but if you would like to see stages 11 through 50, you need to get really good at Lode Runner. I believe this also marks another notable first for the system. the Famicom's first instance of a password system to preserve progression. In order to jump ahead to a stage beyond 10, you need to input a password consisting of in-game visual objects. Basically, the level editor feature from the previous game was reprogrammed here to gate progression. It's an insanely difficult game that takes the mechanics and physics of the original and pushes them to their absolute limit. Frankly, it seems a bit misaimed here. Championship Lode Runner presumes mastery of the original Lode Runner, all 150 stages of it. Given that the Famicom release only contained a third of those stages, you have to wonder how many Famicom Lode Runner fanatics were truly prepared for the ordeal facing them when they picked up this release. I can't help but feel Hudson missed an opportunity here by not publishing the missing 100 levels of Lode Runner for Apple II under the name Lode Runner 2 or something, but instead simply jumped straight ahead to Championship Lode Runner. Anyway, the 50 stages here are just absolutely rage-inducing. Truly, some of the most punishing puzzle action design ever to be published for Famicom. It's the kind of game that should come with a warning label. And of course, into every console, a little rain must fall, where rain is a euphemism for a cascade of bombs from Space Invaders. This is another one of those releases that showed up on SG-1000 and Famicom right around the same time, which allows us to directly compare the two. For once, this comparison does not work in the Famicom's favor. In fact, the Famicom version of Space Invaders is honestly kind of mediocre, especially compared to the really solid SG-1000 release. This adaptation looks wrong, sounds wrong, and even plays a little bit wrong. I honestly went into this episode expecting this adaptation of Space Invaders to be a slam dunk, as it seems like it would be a match made in classic gaming heaven. After all, as I've noted many times throughout this series, the Japanese games industry generally touts one of two pivotal moments as its genesis: the 1978 launch of Space Invaders and the 1983 debut of the Famicom. Here we have those two pop culture Goliaths together at last. How could the result be anything less than extraordinary? Well, as it turns out, Taito found a way. First, this adaptation of Space Invaders takes a critical cue from the Famicom adaptation of one of this game's most beloved spiritual descendants, Galaga. As in Galaga, the right quarter of the screen consists entirely of a scoreboard. This condenses the field of action into closer quarters than in the SG-1000 adaptation of the game. Namco managed to use this approach without significantly compromising Galaga's gameplay, but that's not the case here. The loss of horizontal resolution causes the invading invaders to look squashed compared to the arcade original and Sega's conversion. On top of that, the action feels compressed too, giving less space to the invaders as they march laterally. Once the first column moves beyond the leftmost shield, there's not really enough time to take out the lead aliens before they double back at you. These invaders attack more aggressively than in the arcade game too, lobbing more solid projectiles that can block the player's return fire than they do the zigzagged energy beams. Perhaps most damningly, though, they sound nothing like the invaders of the arcade. In fact, they sound like nothing at all. Space Invaders' soundscape, the relentless, plodding march of the invaders, the airy swish of the player's turret blasting energy beams into space, played an integral role in defining the game experience. The developers behind the Famicom version, which evidently was Tosei, based on the GDRI's research, bizarrely elected to omit this critical element. Again, this compares unfavorably to the SG-1000 release, which managed to simulate the invader march reasonably well. Sega may not have recreated the whoosh of player projectiles correctly, but at least the overall texture of the experience captures the essence of Space Invaders in a recognizable way. With off-kilter gameplay, visual, and audio, this easy slam dunk of a combo, Space Invaders on Famicom, is a huge letdown. Oh well. At least Nintendo would salvage Taito's flop a decade later on Game Boy. Next time on NES Works Gaiden, Konami finally makes its appearance.